Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Let's begin somewhere quiet. Before the battles, before the burning worlds and the fallen suns, before 10,000 years of a corpse on a throne, sustained by the deaths of 1,000 souls every single day. Let's begin with a question that almost nobody in the Warhammer 40,000 universe would even dare to ask out loud, but one that sits at the very heart of everything in this setting. Was the Emperor of mankind actually good? Not capable, not powerful, not visionary. Those things are beyond dispute. The man who unified a shattered, dying terror with his bare will and his legions of engineered warriors, who launched the greatest military campaign in human history, who built an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds. That man was clearly extraordinary in ways that make the word extraordinary feel embarrassingly small. He could see the future. What he had lived through 48,000 years of human history, watching empires rise and collapse, watching the stars themselves flicker and change. He understood the warp in ways that no other human being could comprehend. He was, by almost any measurable standard, the most powerful and most knowledgeable human being who had ever lived. But was he good? Because goodness, in the end, is not measured in victories or in visions. It's measured in choices, in the moments where you could have done differently, and in whether you did. And when you spend long enough studying the Emperor's lore, reading between the lines of the Horus Heresy novels and the Codex entries and the legends and the myths that the Imperium has wrapped around him like burial cloth, a picture starts to emerge that is deeply, genuinely troubling. And not because the Emperor was a monster, but because he wasn't, and the harm he caused was all the worse for that. Today we're going to look at the worst things the Emperor ever did, not in the abstract, philosophical sense of bad policies or questionable leadership styles. We're going to dig into specific decisions, specific moments where the most powerful human in history looked at a situation and made a choice that we can trace, with almost terrifying clarity, directly to the catastrophe that defines this entire universe. The Horus Heresy, the death of billions, the 10,000-year slow collapse of everything he built. And then, at the end, we're going to settle on one act, one moment, one decision that stands above all the others. Not because it was the most viscerally horrifying thing he ever did, but because it was the most preventable, the most deliberate, and the one that unlocked every single door that led to everything else going wrong. But before we get there, we need to understand who we're actually talking about, because the Emperor is not just a character in a story, he is the skeleton of an entire fictional universe. Every Warhammer 40,000 faction, every conflict, every piece of dark irony that makes this setting so uniquely compelling, it all connects back to him. You cannot understand why the Imperium is what it is in the 41st millennium without understanding the choices the Emperor made back in the 30th. And you cannot understand the tragedy of those choices without first understanding who the man making them believed himself to be. So, the Emperor of mankind. Where do you even start? He was born somewhere in Anatolia, us in what is now Turkey, around 8,000 years before the Common Era. That's the lore, or at least one version of it. The Emperor himself is so ancient, and the history around him so tangled with myth and propaganda and deliberate obfuscation, that pinning down certainties is nearly impossible. What is known is that he was, from the very beginning, something other than an ordinary human being, a psyker of staggering natural power, possibly a convergence of ancient shamanic souls who sacrificed themselves to create something capable of guiding humanity through the darkness to come. Possibly something else entirely. The lore is deliberately vague here, and that vagueness is a feature, not a flaw, because it mirrors the uncertainty of the human beings who would one day worship him as a god. What he was not, what he was never supposed to be, was a god. He hated that idea, loathed it, found it dangerous and philosophically repugnant. He had watched for tens of thousands of years as human beings gave their faith to things that didn't deserve it, to priests who used that faith as a weapon, to warlords who called themselves divine, to superstitions that kept people small and frightened and easy to control. He had watched religion be used to justify every atrocity in the long, bloody catalogue of human history, and he had decided, with the kind of certainty that only comes from that much time and that much pain, that he knew better. He believed that humanity's future lay not in faith, but in reason, not in gods, but in knowledge, not in the comfort of the supernatural, but in the cold, clear truth of science and human potential. What he called this philosophy the imperial truth, and he intended it to be the foundation of a new human civilization, one that would finally, after all those millennia of darkness and suffering, grow up. That belief, that certainty, that particular brand of well-intentioned absolutism, it is where everything starts to go wrong. Not because he was incorrect that religion could be dangerous, not because his vision of a rational, unified humanity was in itself evil, but because of what he chose to do with that belief, and what he chose to keep secret, and how he chose to enforce his vision on people who were not necessarily wrong to disagree with him. The emperor was, at his core, a man who had decided he knew best, and he had all the power required to impose that belief on everyone around him, as a not quite enough humility to question whether he should. That combination, genius, power, and an emotional distance from the human beings he was supposedly trying to save, is the recipe for everything that follows. Let's start at the very beginning of where things went wrong. Not with the heresy, not even with the Great Crusade. Let's start with the first people the emperor ever betrayed. Section 2. The Imperial Truth and the Great Lie. If you want to understand why the emperor's decisions were so catastrophically flawed, you need to start with his operating philosophy, the framework that informed every choice he made, every secret he kept, every relationship he managed badly. And that philosophy had a name, the Imperial Truth. In its simplest form, the Imperial Truth was state-mandated atheism. The emperor decreed, as an official policy of the Imperium he was building, that there were no gods, no supernatural beings, no forces beyond science and reason. The universe was a material place, governed by knowable laws, and the duty of humanity was to understand those laws and master them, not to kneel before things in the dark and beg for protection. Iterators, essentially professional philosophers and orators, travelled with the Great Crusade's fleets, spreading this message to every world the Imperium absorbed. Ancient churches were torn down, religious texts were burned, priests and holy men and women were, in the kindest interpretation, made redundant. In the less kind interpretation, they were killed. On the surface of it, this seems reasonable enough for the setting. The warp is real, chaos is real. As the entities that human beings had historically worshipped as gods were in many cases literally drawing power from that worship, feeding on the emotional residue of prayer and devotion to grow stronger and more capable of dragging human souls into damnation. If you understood all of that, and the emperor most certainly did, then promoting atheism starts to look like a pragmatic defensive measure rather than mere ideology. Here's the problem though. Here's the thing that makes the Imperial Truth not merely a policy disagreement, but an active, measurable contributor to the disaster that follows. The emperor knew about chaos. He knew about the warp. He knew that the gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, were real, that they were hungry, that they were patient, and that they were always looking for cracks in human defenses to exploit. He knew all of this, and he told almost nobody, not his generals, not his administrators, not the people on the worlds being liberated, who had their faith stripped away and replaced with cold rationalism and nothing else. He kept the Primarchs mostly in the dark about the true nature of what they were fighting. He built a civilization-spanning policy based on the premise that ignorance of chaos was the best protection against it, that if you didn't know the chaos gods existed, they couldn't reach you. This was a gamble of unimaginable stakes, and he lost it. Think about what this actually meant in practice. The Word-Bearers Legion, under Lorgar Aurelian, was building temples and spreading faith across the worlds they conquered, worshipping the Emperor as a god. What, from a purely logical standpoint, directed worship of a living, present, physically real human being might actually have been less dangerous than unfocused worship of chaos entities. But because the Emperor's policy was that there were no gods, full stop, no exceptions, he couldn't acknowledge that Lorgar's instinct towards spirituality might have been redirectable rather than eliminable. He had to stamp it out. We'll come back to what that led to. Think about Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's most beloved son. When Horus was wounded on Davin and the Word-Bearer's agents arranged for his healing in a chaos-touched temple, Horus's spirit was dragged into the warp and shown visions. Those visions were manipulated by the chaos gods, but they worked because Horus had no framework for understanding what was happening to him. He had never been educated about chaos. He had never been given the tools to recognize that the beautiful, terrible revelation he was experiencing was engineered by beings with an interest in his corruption. The imperial truth had specifically prevented that knowledge from reaching him. And then there was the Council of Nicaea. This was the formal moment where the Emperor, facing a growing dispute about psychic powers within his legions, chose to ban the use of sorcery and the Librarian Corps entirely. On one level, this made sense. Psychic activity does create connections to the warp, and undisciplined use of psychic powers could invite corruption. But on another level, it was another case of the Emperor deciding to manage the danger of chaos by pretending it didn't exist, rather than by educating people about it. Magnus the Red, who understood the warp better than almost anyone, argued at Nicaea that controlled, studied psychic practice was safer than blanket prohibition, because prohibition just meant the warp's dangers went unexamined rather than understood. He was right. The Emperor wasn't prepared to hear it. The broader cost of the imperial truth was immense in ways that even the Emperor seems not to have fully anticipated. The Horus Heresy Book 8, Malevolence, contains a passage that describes it with brutal honesty. Many billions of lives were lost in the purges required to maintain the imperial truth. Ancient civilizations, descended directly from old Earth, carrying their own traditions of faith across the cosmos, were simply murdered for their beliefs. Tens of thousands of cities burned. Entire cultures were put to the sword. And in the name of a philosophy whose core premise was that humanity's future lay in enlightenment rather than fear, the great irony, the one that defines the entire setting, is that the imperial truth didn't just fail. It generated exactly the dynamic it was supposed to prevent. By stripping away every spiritual framework that humanity had developed, by removing the language and the rituals through which people had historically defended themselves from the supernatural, the Emperor left his civilization nakedly vulnerable to chaos in the specific moment it needed those defenses most. Faith, in the world of Warhammer 40,000, is not merely comfort. It is literally functional. The Sisters of Battle perform acts of faith that bend reality. Living saints arise from the power of human belief. And a guardsman who genuinely believes in the Emperor's protection can do things that no amount of training or equipment alone could produce. The Emperor refused to acknowledge any of this, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that gods existed, and he had decided they didn't. And then, because the Chaos Gods are nothing if not patient, the universe waited for the moment when that deliberate blindness would cost the most. The Imperial truth didn't just fail, it was weaponized. Lorgar's Lectitio Divinitatus, the book that argued the Emperor was a god and should be worshipped as one, spread during the heresy not in spite of the Imperial truth's suppression of religion, but because of the spiritual vacuum that suppression had created. Humans are meaning-making creatures. Strip away one framework for meaning, and they will find another. The Emperor had removed all the legitimate ones. Chaos was waiting with something to fill that space. By the 41st millennium, the very philosophy the Emperor had used to justify burning entire civilizations, the imperial truth, was itself considered heresy. The Inquisition would have you executed for promoting atheism. The institutions the Emperor built to demolish religion had become the most ferociously religious organizations in human history. The whole thing had inverted completely, and the Imperium had become the exact kind of ignorant, superstition-driven, priest-controlled hellhole that the Emperor had spent thousands of years trying to prevent. That irony alone is not a crime. But the policy that created it, the decision to enforce a vision of human reason while withholding from humanity the information it needed to make sense of its own universe, that is something darker. That is the Emperor treating the human beings he claimed to protect as variables in his calculation, rather than as people with a right to understand the reality they were living in. It is not the worst thing he ever did, but it is the context within which the worst thing he ever did becomes possible. Section 3. The Thunder Warriors. The first betrayal. Let's go back even further. Before the Great Crusade. Before the Primarchs. Before the Space Marine Legions and the Webway Project and the 1,000 years of war across the stars. Let's go back to Terra itself, before it was unified, when it was still a shattered, a dying world of warring techno-barbarian kingdoms and poisoned skies and billions of human beings killing each other over scraps of a dying civilization. This is where the Emperor's first great act of betrayal happens, and like all his worst acts, it is rooted in the same essential thing, the Emperor's absolute conviction that the ends justified any means, and his willingness to use human beings as instruments for a purpose they were never fully told about and never truly consented to. To understand what happened, you need to understand what the Thunder Warriors were. They were the Emperor's first attempt at creating superhuman soldiers, long before the Space Marines, long before the Primarchs, when the Emperor was still in the process of unifying Terra. But he needed warriors capable of matching the monstrous armies of the techno-barbarian kingdoms. Normal humans wouldn't do. The enemies he faced were too strong, too heavily armed, too desperate. So he went into his laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, and he created something new, something that had never existed before. The Thunder Warriors were massive, larger than most Space Marines would later grow to be. Their physical attributes were extraordinary. Strength and speed and endurance that made ordinary humans look fragile in comparison. They were genetically and chemically enhanced warriors of staggering capability, organized into 20 legions, each led by a commander the Emperor called a Primarch, using that title before it referred to his demigod sons. Yet they fought in the unification wars with a ferocity that became legendary. World after world, kingdom after kingdom, fell before them. The tyrants and warlords of Terra who had held humanity's birthworld in bloody stasis for centuries were ground down and broken. The Thunder Warriors bled for the Emperor. They died in vast numbers for him, charging walls and fortresses, and the monstrous weapons of civilizations that had spent generations preparing for exactly this kind of fight. They knew what they were, tools of conquest, instruments of unification. But they fought with a dedication that suggested they believed in the purpose they were serving. The Emperor was building a future. They were the hammer that was building it, and then their purpose was achieved. After the final battle of the Unification Wars, the Battle of Mount Ararat in the Kingdom of Urartu, where the last major resistance on Terra was broken, the Emperor gave an order. The historical records, carefully constructed and maintained by those loyal to the Emperor's image, say that the Thunder Warriors all died heroically in that final battle, that they gave their lives for the sake of Terra's unity and were remembered as the paragons who made the Imperium possible. That is a lie. The truth, which we piece together from fragments of surviving accounts and from the testimony of those few Thunder Warriors who escaped the cull, is that the Emperor ordered their elimination, not because they had failed him, not because they had turned against him or posed any immediate threat to his plans, but because they had served their purpose. And he had decided that the next stage of his project required something more reliable. The Thunder Warriors were genetically unstable. Their enhancements had been rushed and imperfect. The Emperor's genetic science had not yet reached the refinement it would achieve with the Space Marines. Over time, Thunder Warriors experienced physical and psychological degeneration. Cellular breakdown, growing mental instability, paranoia, and unpredictable violence. The Emperor had engineered a short lifespan into them, whether intentionally or as a consequence of the rushed augmentation process. They were, quite literally, a prototype. Powerful, useful, effective for the specific task of conquering terror, but not the warriors he needed to conquer a galaxy. The Space Marine legions were being developed in parallel. More stable, more numerous, more sustainable, more controllable, and so the Thunder Warriors became, in the Emperor's calculation, obsolete. The method of their elimination was not quick or clean or merciful. The Custodian Guard, the Emperor's own elite bodyguard, was deployed against them. In at least some cases, the nascent Space Marine legions participated. The Thunder Warriors who weren't killed in the final battle were hunted down. Those who survived the initial massacres and went into hiding found themselves running from the very Imperium they had fought to build, their names erased from the records, their sacrifices written out of the history that would celebrate the Emperor's glorious unification of humanity. Only a handful ever escaped the cull. One of the most significant was Aric Tyrannus, known to history as the Lightning Bearer, as the warrior who raised the Emperor's banner at the Battle of Mount Ararat. He survived, went underground, and spent over a century hiding among the masses of Terra's sprawling undercity under assumed names. Tyrannus knew exactly what had happened. He had no illusions about it. And yet, remarkably, the records suggest that even he did not blame the Emperor in the way you might expect. He understood that the Thunder Warriors had always been a means to an end. That understanding didn't make the betrayal less of a betrayal. It just meant that Tyrannus was wise enough, or perhaps broken enough, to recognize the pattern. What makes this worse than simple pragmatic elimination is the cover-up. The Emperor didn't just kill the Thunder Warriors. He made sure nobody would know. He rewrote their story. Yet he turned their murder into a myth of heroic self-sacrifice and used that myth to build the foundation of an Imperium whose entire moral framework was supposed to be based on truth and reason. The first thing the Emperor did to build his enlightened age was create a deliberate historical lie. That lie mattered, not just as a moral failure in itself, though it absolutely is one, but as the first example of a pattern that would repeat over and over throughout the Emperor's rule. The willingness to eliminate those who had served him once they were no longer useful, the cover-up of the messy reality beneath the triumphant narrative, the fundamental disrespect for the people who had bled for his vision, treated not as individuals with inherent worth, but as components to be swapped out when the design changed. Later in the Great Crusade, some Thunder Warriors who had survived the initial cull emerged in a rebellion known as the Cerberus Insurrection. The Emperor dispatched what would later become the World Eaters' Legion to crush them. Despite their physical decline, years of cellular degeneration had taken their toll. These surviving Thunder Warriors fought with such ferocity that they killed 4 to 5 times their number in Space Marines before being finally overcome. These were men and women fighting not against the enemies of the Imperium, but against the Imperium itself, because the Imperium had decided they were a problem to be solved rather than heroes to be honored. There is something very quiet and very terrible about the Thunder Warriors' story. They are not remembered in the Imperium. There are no festivals for them, no monuments. As no chapters of Space Marines who trace their lineage back to these first soldiers. They have been successfully erased from the official memory of humanity's greatest civilization. The children of the civilization they built in blood and death go about their lives with no knowledge that it ever happened. The Emperor killed them, not because they were evil, not because they had become corrupted, not because they posed any ideological threat to his vision. He killed them because they were inconvenient, because he had decided they were replaceable, and because, and this is perhaps the most damning part, he believed that the future he was building was worth any price paid in the present, even if the people paying that price didn't know that was what they were doing. If you want a compact summary of everything that would go wrong with the Emperor's project, the Thunder Warriors' story provides it. The absolute conviction that the end justified the means, the willingness to discard people who had served faithfully, the deliberate dishonesty about what had actually happened, the The belief that the architect of a better future was exempt from the moral standards he expected everyone else to uphold. All of that encoded in the story of those first forgotten soldiers, walking away from their final battle into a history that would pretend they had never existed. Section 4. The problem of Angron, a son abandoned twice. Of all the 20 Primarchs scattered across the galaxy by chaos before the Emperor could raise them, none had a childhood more brutal than Angron. And of all the ways the Emperor failed his sons, and there were many, none was more direct, more personal, or more avoidable than the way he failed the boy who would become the Primarch of the World Eaters. Let's set the scene. Angron landed on Nuceria, a world of cruelty institutionalized, of a ruling aristocracy that had built its entire civilization around the suffering of others. The High Riders of Nuceria kept a population of slaves, specifically bred and trained as gladiators, forced to fight for entertainment in arenas where death was the only real conclusion. They refined their cruelty over generations, developing a technology for their gladiators that was both brilliant and monstrous: cortical implants, devices hammered through the skull and into the brain itself, with trailing cables like terrible dreadlocks across the neck and shoulders, rewiring the neurochemistry of whoever they were placed in. These implants became known as the butcher's nails. What they did, technically, was elegant in its horror. They suppressed the production of serotonin, the neurochemical associated with satisfaction, contentment, and emotional regulation. They deadened the limbic lobe and the insular cortex, the parts of the brain responsible for processing emotion, empathy, and the full spectrum of human feeling. What they left was rage, pure, undiluted, neurochemically enforced rage, activated most intensely in combat, creating a feedback loop where the only relief a subject could experience was in the violence of battle. Outside of fighting, the nails would punish their host, a constant grinding agony, a state of perpetual emotional starvation where everything except blood and combat felt flat and painful. The nails were designed for slave gladiators. They were a form of torture disguised as enhancement, and they were hammered into Angron's skull when he was a child. Not just Angron, either. The High Riders of Nuceria had imposed the nails on a whole cohort of gladiators, creating an arena slave force of terrible, pain-driven warriors. And Angron, because of who he was, because of what the Emperor's genetic engineering had built into his fundamental nature, even without the Primarch being present to guide it, had risen to lead them, not through domination, through something closer to love. Angron had looked at these broken, tortured people and seen his family. He had fought for them, bled for them, and when the opportunity arose, he had led them in revolt. That revolt is one of the most important moments in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, and almost nobody in the Imperium knows it happened. Angron and his slave warriors had risen up. They had fought the High Riders and their forces across the world of Nuceria, a desperate, bloody, glorious rebellion of the broken against those who had broken them. They were outnumbered. They were surrounded on a hillside, the armies of their oppressors closing in from all directions. They were going to die. Angron knew they were going to die. Every man and woman fighting beside him knew they were going to die, but they were going to die free, fighting together. And there is a kind of defiant dignity in that which transcends any individual life. And then the Emperor arrived, not to help them, not to join the fight, and not to turn the tide against the High Riders' armies and free the people Angron had spent his life trying to protect. The Emperor arrived, saw Angron, recognized him as one of his lost sons, and teleported him aboard the fleet. Just him, only him, while his people, the men and women he had fought beside, the closest thing to a family he had ever known, were slaughtered in the valley below. Angron himself described what was done to him in terms that have never lost their power. He looked at what the Emperor had given to other Primarchs, how Guilliman's foster father had been honoured, how the Lion had been allowed to keep his closest kin, how Corferon, Lorgar's adoptive father, had been elevated to a position of authority in the Wordbearers, and he asked, very simply, why not for him? Why did the Emperor save everyone else's human connections and not his? Why did the Emperor teleport him away from his people and let them die? Rather than coming down with his custodians and his space marines, and fighting beside Angron's army to victory? The honest answer is that it would have been inconvenient. The Great Crusade had a schedule. There were stars to conquer. A Primarch stranded on a primitive backwater world, wrapped up in the politics of a slave revolt, was something to be quickly extracted and reintegrated into the grand plan. The people dying in the valley were not part of the Emperor's plan. They were not human beings the Emperor seems to have considered worth the cost of delaying his project. Angron was brought aboard his legion's flagship. What the World Eaters, still called the Warhounds at that point, met their Primarch. He refused to acknowledge them. He stood at a viewport and watched Nuceria grow smaller as the fleet carried him away. And the grief and the rage that lived in him because of the nails had no language for what he was feeling, no pathway to process it, no capacity to grieve in any way, except the way the nails made everything look like combat. Now, the butcher's nails. After Angron was brought aboard, the Emperor arranged for the implants to be examined. The best tech priests the Mechanicum could provide were given access to Angron, sedated and unconscious, to study the devices in his skull. Their conclusion was clear and unambiguous. The nails had replaced critical sections of Angron's brain. The limbic lobe and insular cortex were gone, was replaced by the implant's tendrils, which had grown deep into his neural architecture over the years since they were first installed. Angron literally could not survive without them at this point. Removing them would kill him as surely as removing his heart. But here is the part that some interpretations of the lore hint at, the part that makes the Emperor's specific role in this darker than a simple nothing could be done narrative. In the novel Master of Mankind, Arkan Land, one of the Empire's most brilliant minds, is summoned to examine Angron's implants. The Emperor himself is present, and the Emperor's detachment during this examination is noted as remarkable even to Land, who expected a divine figure to be emotionally removed from such matters. Thus, there is a strain of interpretation in the lore that suggests the Emperor could have done more, that a being capable of designing the Space Marines from scratch, capable of operating the webway, capable of things that strain the definition of possibility, that such a being, presented with archaeotech implants from the dark age of technology, might have found a solution if he had genuinely tried. The nails, at their core, were sophisticated but not incomprehensible. They were technology. Everything is technology, given sufficient time and genius. Whether the Emperor genuinely could not remove the nails, or whether the truth is something more uncomfortable, that a compromised Primarch was still a Primarch, still a weapon, still useful, is left deliberately ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is that the nails were never removed. Would that Angron spent his entire existence in the service of the Imperium in a state of constant neurological torture, that every battle he fought, every act of terrible violence he performed, every massacre the World Eaters committed in the name of the Emperor, all of it was conducted by a being who had not experienced relief from pain since childhood, who had not been able to feel joy, or peace, or love, or anything except the brief chemical reward of combat, since the High Riders of Nuceria first hammered metal into his skull. And the Emperor did not tell this story. He did not address what had been done to Angron. He integrated Angron into the structure of the Great Crusade, gave him a legion of warriors to lead, and sent him to conquer worlds. And when the nails began to spread to the broader World Eaters' legion, when Angron had his legion's tech priests reverse engineer the devices and implant them into his warriors, the Emperor apparently accepted this as an unfortunate byproduct of a necessary asset, rather than as an alarm signal worth investigating. The Night of the Wolf, the confrontation between the Space Wolves and the World Eaters that occurred when Leman Russ was sent to bring Angron to account for his legion's deteriorating mental state, offered a moment where the situation might have been addressed. Instead, it was managed, minimized. The nails continued to spread. The World Eaters continued their descent into a state of barely controlled berserker fury. Angron, when he finally fell to chaos and was transformed into a demon prince of Khorne, became everything his tortured life had prepared him to become. He became pure rage, a pure violence. The thing the nails had spent decades trying to force him to be. an engine of war with no capacity for anything else, was finally, horrifically achieved. Chaos didn't corrupt Angron so much as complete what Nuceria had started, and the Emperor had declined to interrupt. That is the Emperor's failure with Angron, not the nails themselves, which the Emperor didn't install, but the abandonment, the casual teleportation that saved an asset and left a family to die, the failure to reckon honestly with what had been done to Angron, the decision to use a broken, tortured being as a weapon for decades rather than confronting the moral horror of his situation, the willingness to look at a son who was in constant agony and decide that the agony was acceptable because the asset remained functional. As if the Thunder Warriors represent the Emperor's first betrayal of those who served him, Angron represents something different, and in some ways, darker. The Emperor's betrayal of a son who never had the choice to serve anyone else, who was brought into the project by force, whose grief and rage were noted and filed away as a tactical consideration, who was given a legion to lead and wars to fight as a kind of distraction from the thing that was eating him alive. Angron never forgave the Emperor. That refusal, that absolute burning, pain-driven refusal to pretend that what had been done to him was acceptable, is, in the context of the 40,000 universe, one of the most understandable responses in the entire setting. You don't have to agree with everything that followed to understand why Angron felt the way he did. The Emperor abandoned his people and then expected his gratitude. That is not a relationship. That is ownership dressed in the language of family. And the Emperor had not finished failing his sons. Not by a long way. Section 5. The abandonment. Leaving the Great Crusade. Picture the scene from Horus's perspective. You are Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the Lunar Wolves. You have spent 2 centuries fighting the greatest war in human history. At the side of your father, the most powerful being in the known galaxy. You have conquered world after world in his name. You have bled for him, mourned friends and warriors for him, bent your entire considerable genius to the task of building the civilization he dreamed of. You have been, without question, the finest general of the finest army in all of human history. And the man who made you has been there beside you, watching, guiding, pushing forward with the shared weight of a project that felt, at its grandest moments, like the salvation of humanity itself. And then, after a victory so enormous that the celebration stretched across an entire world, after the triumph of Ulanor, where the greatest orc horde in recorded history was broken, and the Emperor himself declared you War Master over all Imperial forces, your father leaves. Not to fight somewhere else, not to address a crisis more pressing than the Great Crusade. He leaves for Terra, for some project he will not explain, for something locked in the basements of the Imperial Palace that apparently requires his personal, a constant attention so urgently that he cannot spare even a clear explanation of what it is or why it matters. He does not tell you what he is doing. He does not tell you why. He does not explain to any of his sons, not even to you, his most beloved, his War Master, the one he chose above all others to lead in his absence, what the great work is that calls him back to Terra. He simply leaves. And the implication, unspoken but unmistakable, is that you and your brothers are now expected to continue building his empire without him, without knowing what the ultimate goal is, and without being trusted enough to share in the truth of his plan. This is the moment, not the beginning of the Horus heresy. That comes later, through specific manipulations, and specific choices, and specific wounds that hadn't yet been opened. But this is the moment when the emotional conditions that make the heresy possible are set in place, because Horus begins to ask a question that he cannot answer, a question that sits in the back of his mind through all the campaigns, and the victories, and the loneliness of command growing heavier with each passing year. Why doesn't he trust me? The Emperor's decision to abandon the Great Crusade and return to Terra to pursue his secret webway project is one of the most consequential leadership failures in any fiction I've ever encountered. It is a masterclass in how to destroy the loyalty of people who love you, and it is achieved not through cruelty or betrayal, but through silence and secrecy. let's explain the Webway project itself. Almost because understanding what the Emperor was actually trying to do matters for understanding why he kept it secret. The Webway was the Elders' ancient transit network.
Okay, now before I keep going, I just want to take a second because I think about this stuff way more than I probably should. The thing that gets me about the Emperor genuinely is that he's not incompetent. That's what makes all of this hard to sit with. A truly incompetent ruler is almost easier to forgive. You can chalk it up to ignorance. But the Emperor, he always knew. He could see the threads of probability stretching out across time. He understood human nature better than any being alive, and he still made these calls. Monarchia, Angron, the Thunder Warriors, none of these are accidents. They're choices. And I think that's why I keep coming back to this lore. Honestly, it's not fun in the way a lot of 40k is fun. It's uncomfortable. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
A network of tunnels running beneath or between real space, constructed from a psychically resistant material that kept them isolated from the warp. The Elder had used it to travel between the stars instantaneously, without the dangers of warp travel, without the navigators and the psychics screaming, and the risk of demons, and the fundamental horror of passing through a dimension made of emotion and inhabited by things that wanted to eat your soul. It was, by any measure, the safest and most reliable method of faster-than-light travel imaginable. The Emperor had discovered a Webway portal beneath what would become the Imperial Palace on Terra, and he had conceived an enormous plan to build human versions of Webway tunnels, expanding humanity's access to this network. The Golden Throne, the machine he had been constructing, would serve as the anchor point, with a sufficiently powerful psyker seated on it to maintain the psychic wards protecting these new tunnels from warp intrusion. If it had worked, if the Emperor had been able to build out a human Webway network, connecting the worlds of the Imperium through safe passages immune to chaos, the entire nature of humanity's civilization would have changed. No more dependency on the Astronomicon, no more navigators, no more warp travel with all its attendant horrors, no more demon incursions through the routes between stars. The Chaos Gods would have been cut off from one of their primary methods of reaching humanity. It was, genuinely, an extraordinary vision, but the Emperor kept it secret. He kept it secret from almost everyone. Not even the Primarchs knew why he had returned to Terra. The custodians who fought and died in the Webway's tunnels weren't told what they were protecting. The thousands of Mechanicum workers who labored to build the new tunnels didn't understand the purpose of what they were constructing. Only Malkador, the Sigillite, and perhaps Constantin Valdor knew the full scope of the plan. Why the secrecy? Several theories float through the lore. The navigators, who held a monopoly on warp travel, would have been threatened by a successful Webway network and might have worked to sabotage it, which actually happened, with a navigator faction attempting to destroy a prototype connected to the Golden Throne. Whilst the Emperor may have feared chaos manipulation of the project if too many people knew about it, he may have simply had the instincts of someone who had spent thousands of years as a solitary planner, reluctant to share the architecture of his thinking with anyone. But none of those explanations, even if we accept them as valid, change what the secrecy cost. Because what the secrecy cost was Horus. Not all at once, not in a single moment of revelation, but slowly, accumulating over months and years, as Horus led the crusade and felt the increasing distance between himself and his father. The question kept growing. The Chaos Gods, patient and brilliant, recognized exactly what kind of wound was opening in the War Master's heart. Whilst they recognized the mixture of love and resentment and confusion and pride that was festering in the man who had been told he was the most trusted and then treated as if he couldn't be trusted with the most important secret in existence. Erebus and the Word-Bearers had been preparing for this moment for decades. When Horus was wounded on Davin and his spirit was guided into the warp to be shown a manipulated vision of the future. A future where the Emperor abandoned all his sons to pursue his own divinity, where the Primarchs were discarded the way the Thunder Warriors had been discarded. That vision worked not because it was true, but because it mapped perfectly onto the doubt that the Emperor's silence had been building for years. Yet the Emperor's decision to keep the Webway project secret meant that when the Chaos Gods offered Horus a narrative, "You are being used," You are being lied to. Your father plans to discard you when his real project is complete. There was nothing in Horus's experience of his father to contradict it. No honest conversation had taken place. No trust had been offered in the place of instructions. No acknowledgement that Horus deserved to understand the vision he was being asked to serve. Think about how simply this could have been avoided. Think about how small the change required was. The Emperor could have sat down with Horus, with all his sons, ideally, but even just with Horus, and said, "This is what I am doing. This is why. This is the enemy we are actually facing. These are the entities who want humanity destroyed, and here is how they work. I need you to complete the Great Crusade, while I work on a solution to the deepest threat we face. I trust you with this knowledge because you have earned that trust." That conversation never happened. The Emperor appears to have been constitutionally incapable of having it, not because of cruelty or contempt, but because of that particular combination of certainty and emotional distance that defined everything he did. He knew best. He had always known best. He had been planning this for longer than most human civilizations had existed. Why would he explain himself to children, even brilliant ones, even beloved ones? Well, that incapacity, that specific failure of emotional intelligence dressed up as the rational confidence of a superior mind, created the space for the Horus heresy to grow in. And the consequences didn't stop with Horus. The other Primarchs felt the abandonment too. Mortarion, who had already developed resentment toward the Emperor over matters personal to him, found in the Emperor's disappearance confirmation that his suspicions were correct. Angron had his own burning grievances. Fulgrim was sinking into the influence of a demon-possessed artifact, with no guidance from a father who might have recognized the warning signs. The entire fragile ecosystem of 20 demigods, each bearing their own psychological wounds and complicated relationships with authority. It was left to function without the one person whose presence might have kept things stable. The Webway project was, in conception, magnificent. In execution, as a leadership decision, it was a catastrophe, not because the goal was wrong, but because the Emperor treated it as more important than the relationships that were the actual foundation of his power. He poured everything into a project that required secrecy and left the empire building, the human work, the maintenance of loyalty and trust and family, left all of that to take care of itself. It didn't take care of itself. And when Magnus shattered the Webway wards while trying to warn the Emperor of Horus's corruption, an act born of the exact kind of desperate love that the Emperor had systematically failed to cultivate in his other sons, the project was destroyed in a single psychic catastrophe, and the Emperor was chained to the Golden Throne, not as part of his plan, but as an emergency measure to prevent Terra itself from being overrun by demons. The Emperor's greatest secret, the plan he sacrificed so much to protect, ended up imprisoning him in exactly the way he had most feared. And the galaxy burned anyway. Section 6. Monarchia. The perfect crime. We've arrived at the heart of it. Everything before this moment. The Thunder Warriors, Angron, the Webway secret. These are the acts of a man who is cold, who is calculating, who makes terrible choices while maintaining a kind of plausible distance. He didn't mean to harm the Thunder Warriors. They were just obsolete. He didn't mean to break Angron. The nails were already there when he found him. He didn't mean to isolate Horus. The secret was necessary. But what happened on the world of Kur? What happened in and around the city the word-bearers called Monarchia, the perfect city? That is different. That is the Emperor making a deliberate choice, in full knowledge of what it would mean, to do something that cannot be explained away by cold logic or the necessities of a grand plan. That is the Emperor taking a person who loved him more completely than anyone else in the universe and breaking that person on purpose. Let's understand who Lorgar was before we explain what the Emperor did to him. Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the Wordbearers Legion, the theologian, the writer, the man who looked at the galaxy and felt, more deeply than any of his brothers, that there had to be something larger than the material universe to give it meaning. He was not a fool. He was not, despite what some readings of the lore suggest, simply a fanatic. He was a philosopher. He was someone who had grown up on Colchis, a world shaped by ancient religious tradition, and whose entire intellectual framework for understanding reality was built around the concept of the sacred. When the Emperor arrived on Colchis and Lorgar recognized him from visions he had been having since childhood, visions of a golden figure who would come from the sky and change everything, he fell to his knees, not in weakness, but in the deepest conviction of his life. This was it. This was the divine made real. This was the thing his entire existence had been preparing him to serve. And he served, with everything he had. The word-bearers, under Lorgar's command, fought for the Emperor with an intensity that even other Primarchs noted. But they fought differently. They didn't just conquer worlds, they converted them. Every planet that fell to the word-bearers was rebuilt in the image of Lorgar's faith. Temples rose to the glory of the God Emperor. Populations were catechized. The word-bearers lingered on worlds long after military victory, ensuring that the faith had truly taken root before moving on to the next. Their progress in the Great Crusade was slower than their brothers, but their compliance rates were more thorough. As their populations more genuinely devoted, their contributions to the Imperium deeper and more lasting. This was a problem for the Emperor, whose imperial truth required that there be no religion, not even religion centered on him. Especially not religion centered on him, because the Emperor knew, or believed he knew, that worshipping him as a god was dangerous. It would feed the mechanisms of chaos. It would create exactly the psychic dynamic that the chaos gods could exploit. He had to stop it. For a century, he let it continue. For 100 years, the word-bearers built temples and wrote sacred texts and converted populations in the Emperor's name, and the Emperor let it happen. He was aware of it. It's the military bureaucracy around the Great Crusade eventually noted the discrepancy between the word-bearers' slower pace and the other legions. Investigations were conducted, reports were filed. The truth of what the word-bearers were doing was not hidden, it was simply ignored for an extraordinarily long time. Then suddenly, the Emperor decided enough was enough. And here is where the act begins. Here is where the Emperor's response crosses from firm but understandable policy correction into something that reveals exactly how poorly he understood his own son and how little he cared about understanding him. The Emperor chose not to speak to Lorgar privately. He did not summon his son for a careful, frank conversation about the nature of the imperial truth and why religion threatened the project they were building together. As he did not explain, as he never explained anything to anyone, what the actual danger was. He did not offer Lorgar's obvious gifts as a preacher and philosopher, a different channel. He did not even simply issue an order directly to the word-bearers and give them time to adjust their practices. He sent the Ultramarines, Robut Guilliman's legion, known for their precision, their loyalty to the letter of imperial law, and their relative indifference to the emotional dimensions of warfare. He sent them to the planet Hur, to the city of Monarchia, the perfect city, the place that, for the word-bearers, was the greatest achievement of their faith and their labor. A city built from the ruins of a conquered world and shaped into something that was supposed to be an exemplar of human civilization under the Emperor's divine guidance. A place of temples and archives and schools and art, all dedicated to the glory of the being the word-bearers believed was the god of humanity. The Ultramarines burned it to the ground. Not a battle, not a legitimate military engagement, an object lesson. They demolished Monarchia so completely that the devastation covered a quarter of a continent. They reduced everything the word-bearers had built, everything they believed in, everything they had worked for over 100 years, to ash and rubble. And then, and this is the part that makes this act unique among the Emperor's crimes, with the part that elevates it from mere callousness into something that feels almost deliberately calculated for maximum psychological damage. The Emperor arrived in person. He came with Malkador the Sigillite. The entire Word-Bearers Legion, 100,000 Space Marines, was summoned by a single astropathic distress call from the people of Kur. Their fleet arrived in orbit to find their beloved world in ruins, and Rabute Gilliman waiting on the Vox to give them their orders. Assemble on the surface. In the ashes of Monarchia, 100,000 warriors of the Emperor gathered in the shadow of everything they had ever believed in, reduced to smoking debris, their Primarch among them. And then the Emperor himself walked toward them, and with the full power of his psychic might, not a metaphor, not an exaggeration, but the literal application of the most powerful human psyker who had ever lived, he forced them to kneel, every single one of them. Lorgar included, the Primarch who had spent his entire life in service to his father's glory, who had written the Lectitio Divinitatis out of the overflow of his devotion, who had looked at the Emperor and seen the living proof of everything he had ever believed, kneeling in the ash of the city that had been built in his father's name, unable even to stand of his own volition. The Emperor spoke. He told them they had failed him. He told them they had failed humanity. He told them he was not a god and would not suffer their worship. He was cold. He was dismissive. Yet he had the Ultramarines standing over the word-bearers in judgment while he spoke, a deliberate staging that amplified the humiliation with a careful cruelty, positioning the most efficient, most unspiritual legion as the witnesses to the disgrace of the most devoted one. And then he left. He didn't stay to explain why this mattered. He didn't stay to help Lorgar understand what had gone wrong and how to do better. He didn't offer the warmth or the guidance or the simple human acknowledgement that a person in complete psychological collapse might need from their father. He delivered his judgment, crushed the spirit of 100,000 Space Marines, and walked away. Lorgar, by the accounts, was in shock. He spent a month afterward in his private chambers, speaking to no one except his two most trusted advisors, Corferon, his adoptive father from Colchis, and the Legion's first chaplain Erebus, both of whom, it turned out, had been secret devotees of chaos for years. The Chaos Gods were not caught off guard by Monarchia. They had been watching Lorgar for a long time. They had recognized in him the qualities they most needed. Not martial power, not raw psychic force, but the deeper and more durable power of genuine faith. Lorgar believed, not as a habit or a cultural affiliation, but in the way that transforms a person from the inside out. He was, at his core, a creature of devotion. And devotion, redirected, is the most powerful spiritual weapon in existence. In the depths of his despair, shattered, humiliated, his father's love revealed to have conditions he had never understood. At his life's work reduced to ash, Lorgar reached the single most important question of his existence. If the Emperor was not a god, then what was? If the thing he had given his whole soul to deserved no worship, then where did worship go? The Chaos Gods were ready with an answer. Corferon and Erebus, whispering in the darkness of Lorgar's grief, suggested a pilgrimage, a journey to find the truth of the universe, to discover whether there were, anywhere in creation, beings truly worthy of worship. The Emperor had 5 custodians shadowing the word-bearers to ensure they had returned to proper behavior. Those custodians went with them on the pilgrimage, presumably watching but not understanding what they were watching. The 1,301st Expeditionary Fleet travelled to the edge of known space, toward the Eye of Terror. And there, guided by an entity called Ingathal the Ascended, Lorgar received his revelation. The Chaos Gods were real. They were genuinely transcendent. They wanted to be worshipped. They were, as far as anyone could tell, the only gods actually in existence. The Emperor had told Lorgar to stop worshipping gods because there were no gods. There were. Lorgar had been right all along that the universe was spiritual, that it was animated by forces beyond the merely material, that faith mattered and the sacred was real. The Emperor had been lying, or at minimum catastrophically wrong in what he'd chosen to share, and Lorgar's entire destroyed life had been the price of that deception. The conversion was complete, not instantly. The full process took years, and the word-bearer's apparent return to dutiful compliance after Monarchia was a performance, a mask worn over 40 years of meticulous, patient planning. But the soul of it happened in that moment of revelation in the Eye of Terror. the most devoted servant of the Emperor in the Imperium, looked at the cosmos and decided that there were gods worth worshipping. And then he decided, with cold and furious precision, to make sure the rest of the galaxy knew it. For the next 4 decades, Lorgar worked. He didn't rage. He didn't rebel openly. He built. He created the warrior lodges, secretive fraternal organizations within the Space Marine legions that would serve as channels for chaos corruption. He positioned the word-bearers near Horus, close enough to be trusted, close enough to whisper. He arranged for the events on Davin that would give chaos access to the War Master's wounded spirit. He spent 40 years threading needles, setting traps, planting seeds in soil he had carefully prepared, and the Emperor apparently didn't notice, or didn't notice in time, or noticed and dismissed it because the word-bearers' compliance numbers had improved after Monarchia, and there was no obvious sign of what was growing beneath the surface. The argument for Monarchia as the worst thing the Emperor ever did is not just about scale, though the scale is incomprehensible. It is about the nature of the act and what it reveals. Because Monarchia was not a failure of knowledge, the Emperor wasn't ignorant of what Lorgar was. He wasn't blindsided by his son's devotion. He had watched the word-bearers for 100 years. He knew exactly how deep Lorgar's faith ran, how completely it defined him, what it would mean to Lorgar to have that faith systematically demolished in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. He chose to do it anyway, and he chose to do it without offering any replacement, any guidance, any acknowledgement that the instinct toward devotion and meaning that Lorgar embodied was itself something that needed addressing rather than simply crushing. He treated a man who was his son and who loved him completely as an obstacle to be cleared rather than a person to be guided. The Chaos Gods had been waiting for exactly this moment, not because they caused it. Monarchia was entirely the Emperor's own work, but because they understood something the Emperor's cold rationalism apparently couldn't, that a person is not simply an obstacle or an asset. That grief and devotion, when they have nowhere to go, don't disappear, they transform. Section 7. Lorgar's pilgrimage and the 40-year conspiracy. In the years following Monarchia, the word-bearers became something that nobody around them fully understood, because the transformation was designed specifically to look like the opposite of what it was. The Emperor was reportedly pleased. The legion that had been his slowest, most distracted, most ideologically problematic child had returned to the Great Crusade with a fury that made their previous efforts look like preliminary sketches. The worlds fell before them in rapid order. No more lingering to build temples. No more theological work. Just conquest, swift and merciless. The Emperor looked at this and read it as evidence that his lesson had worked. The word-bearers had understood their error and were atoning for it. Good, just as he had intended. He was wrong on a level so fundamental that it is almost difficult to credit. What looked like reformed zeal was actually rehearsal. The word-bearers were burning through their military objectives quickly now, not because they had abandoned their faith, but because faith was no longer their purpose. Their purpose was the patient, meticulous construction of the mechanism that would end the Imperium. Every campaign was now logistics for something larger. Every alliance with a brother legion was an opportunity to plant seeds. Every apparent act of loyalty was a performance for an audience that would never suspect what was being prepared because it was too vast to see from the inside. Lorgar's specific genius, and he was a genius, in the specific way that only someone who has taken the full measure of human spiritual psychology can be, was understanding that the Horus heresy could not be created by simple force. The Primarchs and their legions were too strong, too loyal, too well knit by the shared experience of the Great Crusade to be broken by anything as blunt as an assault. The heresy had to be grown from within. It had to exploit existing tensions and personal wounds and the specific vulnerabilities of specific people. And Lorgar knew those vulnerabilities better than anyone because he had spent 2 centuries watching his brothers. Yet he knew Horus's hunger for acknowledgement. He knew Angron's volcanic rage and the specific way it had been shaped by the butcher's nails and the Emperor's abandonment of his people. He knew Mortarian's resentment toward the Emperor for reasons that trace back to Mortarian's own bitter homeworld. He knew Fulgrim's consuming pride and perfectionism. He knew the specific texture of each wound in each brilliant man that could be pried open with the right words at the right moment. The warrior lodges were the infrastructure for this, secretive fraternal organizations, nominally existing to foster brotherhood between the ranks, spread into almost every legion. In the ones that turned traitor, those lodges became conduits for chaos corruption, places where ideas about the Emperor's failings could be shared, so where resentments could be validated, where the first whispers of the primordial truth could be tested. Erebus, Lorgar's first chaplain, and the architect of many of the heresy's most precise interventions, moved between legions with remarkable freedom, trusted because the word-bearer's apparent reform had made them seem like safe companions. It was Erebus who arranged the event on Davin. It was Erebus who ensured that the blade that wounded Horus was the kind of weapon that couldn't be healed by ordinary means, that required exactly the kind of mystical intervention that would bring Horus's spirit into the warp and give the Chaos Gods their moment with him. Erebus was acting on Lorgar's orders, and Lorgar was acting on the command of gods who had been planning this for longer than the Imperium had existed. Think about the patience involved. 40 years. 4 decades of flawless deception, of wearing a mask so convincingly that the most powerful psyker in existence, a man who had survived 48,000 years by reading people, looked at the word-bearers and saw loyal servants. 4 decades of building something so carefully embedded in the legitimate structure of the Imperium that when it finally activated, the response time was measured in minutes rather than years. The Istvan III atrocity, the drop site massacre at Istvan V, the betrayal of the Ultramarines and their forces at Kauth, where Lorgar's legion ambushed their supposed allies and irradiated an entire planet, killing billions and awakening Guilliman to the reality of the heresy already in progress. Off the Ruinstorm, the massive warp tempest that Angron and Lorgar generated through the Shadow Crusade, which cut off 4 entire loyalist legions from Terra at the critical moment of the war. All of this was Lorgar's work. The man who loved the Emperor so completely that he spent his whole life building temples in his honor, spent the heresy systematically destroying everything the Emperor had built, with a thoroughness and a strategic genius that would have been admirable if it weren't catastrophic. And all of it, the entire architecture of the Horus heresy as a conspiracy, as a coordinated operation rather than simply a series of individual betrayals, traces back to Monarchia, to the moment when the Emperor chose humiliation over conversation, chose example over guidance. She chose to break his most devoted son, rather than engage with the genuine philosophical question that Sun had been raising. Lorgar was the first Primarch to fall to chaos, not the most famous. That distinction belongs to Horus, but the first, and in terms of historical consequence, the most important. Because Lorgar didn't just fall, he went back and corrupted the others. Without Lorgar, there is no heresy. There is no systematic corruption of the legions. No carefully engineered trap on Davin. No warrior lodges spreading doubt through the ranks. Without Lorgar, Horus might have harbored resentments and made mistakes, but there would have been no one ready and willing and capable of turning those resentments into a galaxy-spanning civil war. Lorgar is the heresy, not Horus. Horus was the weapon, Lorgar was the weapon maker. And the Emperor made him. Section 8, Magnus and Prospero, the warning that destroyed everything. There is a particular kind of tragedy that arises when good intentions collide with bad timing and a father's stubborn refusal to trust his son. The story of Magnus the Red and the burning of Prospero is that tragedy in full. Magnus the Red was arguably the most intellectually brilliant of all the Primarchs. Where Lorgar sought meaning in devotion and Guilliman found it in order, Magnus found it in knowledge. His homeworld of Prospero was a sanctuary for psychers, human beings who could touch the warp directly and use it to work what others would call miracles. And Magnus had built on that foundation something extraordinary. A civilization defined by the pursuit of understanding. The great librarium of Prospero was the city of Tizca, with its gleaming silver spires and its archives of arcane knowledge collected from across the galaxy. The 15 cults of the Thousand Suns, that each specialized in a different discipline of psychic practice. All of it was Magnus's life's work, and it was genuinely magnificent. Magnus was also, from the Emperor's perspective, a persistent problem. The Emperor had a complicated relationship with psychic ability. He himself was the most powerful human psyker who had ever lived, and his entire project depended on psychic infrastructure. The Astronomicon that guided ships through the warp, the sanctioned astropaths who transmitted messages between worlds, his own constant psychic vigilance over the Webway project. But he was acutely aware of how dangerous undisciplined psychic practice was, and how easily it could create connections to chaos, how the gap between a controlled psychic act and an invitation to demonic possession could be terrifyingly small. Magnus didn't see it that way. Magnus believed, with the conviction of someone who had spent his life studying the subject, that the answer to the dangers of psychic power was not suppression, but mastery. Not prohibition, but understanding. The more you knew about the warp, the better equipped you were to work within it safely. Ignorance wasn't protection. Ignorance was exposure. The Emperor disagreed, and at the Council of Nicaea, the great gathering of imperial leadership that the Emperor convened specifically to settle the question of psychic powers within the Space Marine legions, the Emperor made his position definitive. He banned librarians. He banned the use of sorcery. He declared that any violation of this edict would make the violator his enemy, and the punishment for violation would be severe. Magnus attended Nicaea. He argued his position. He was overruled. He left the council bitter and convinced, correctly, that the whole proceeding had been rigged against him. And then he went back to Prospero and kept doing what he had been doing, because he genuinely believed that the Emperor was wrong about this, and because Magnus, for all his wisdom, had a specific kind of arrogance rooted in his absolute certainty that he understood the warp better than anyone else alive. He was right about that, actually. He did understand it better. He was also catastrophically wrong about his ability to use that understanding safely, because understanding something dangerous and being immune to its dangers are very different things. Then came the vision. Magnus, meditating on Prospero, reached out through the warp in the way that only someone with his extraordinary gifts could manage, and he saw it. He saw the future unfolding. Horus, corrupted, half the legions turning traitor, the Istva massacres, the heresy, the death of billions, the siege of Terra, all of it, laid out before him with the horrifying clarity of genuine precognition. He had to warn the Emperor. His first instinct was to try to reach Horus directly, to enter his brother's mind during a chaos ritual on Davin and try to pull him back from the edge. That didn't work. The ritual was too advanced, Horus too far gone, the chaos entities too well entrenched. Magnus couldn't save him directly. Once he needed to warn the Emperor, and here is where his own hubris intersected fatally with the Emperor's failures. Magnus could have sent an astropathic message. Slower, yes. Less vivid, but safer. His advisors told him this. Ahriman and others among the Thousand Suns' senior commanders argued that there were better ways to get the message to Terra, ones that didn't require the kind of dramatic psychic intervention that Magnus was contemplating. He dismissed their counsel. Instead, he performed a ritual, an astral projection that hurtled his spirit through the warp at tremendous speed, tearing toward Terra, seeking the fastest possible path to the Emperor's presence. And in the warp, he found a corridor, a human-constructed corridor, part of the Emperor's secret Webway project. He couldn't breach it. The psychic walls were too strong. And then an anonymous voice from within the warp offered him power, more power than he needed to break through. Magnus accepted, without hesitation, without caution. He was Magnus the Red. He understood the warp better than anyone alive. Whatever was offering him power, he could handle it. He couldn't. He breached the Webway corridor, and his spirit burst into the Imperial Palace beneath the Golden Throne. Appearing in the Emperor's presence as an astral projection, he had made it. He had the Emperor's attention. He had his warning ready to deliver. The Emperor didn't listen to the warning. He was furious, not at Horus's betrayal, which the warning described, at Magnus, at the audacity of this son who had stood at Nicaea and pledged, or appeared to pledge, to abandon sorcery, and then demonstrated exactly the kind of reckless, arrogant psychic intervention that the Nicaea Edict had been specifically designed to prevent. The breach Magnus had forced through the webway corridor had shattered the psychic wards the Emperor had spent years constructing. Demons poured through the gap into the human sections of the webway. The thousands of Mechanicum adepts working in the tunnels were slaughtered. The project that the Emperor had sacrificed everything to protect was ruined in a single moment. The Emperor banished Magnus from his presence. He did not listen to what Magnus had to say about Horus. He called for Leman Russ and the Space Wolves. Now, here is where the fault lines in this story become almost impossible to navigate with any simple moral assignment. Magnus was not innocent. He violated the Nicaea Edict knowingly. Yet he accepted power from an anonymous entity in the warp, which is the kind of thing that should have triggered every alarm he possessed. He destroyed the Emperor's life's work in the act of trying to save him. He had spent years refusing to fully acknowledge the weight of the risks his continued psychic practice created. There is genuine culpability here, but the Emperor's response was not measured culpability assessment. It was rage. He sent Leman Russ to bring Magnus back to Terra, a legitimate response, if harshly phrased. But then Horus, who had already fully corrupted by this point and was manipulating events with precise, terrible skill, intercepted Leman Russ. And Horus told Russ, leveraging Russ's pre-existing dislike of Magnus, or leveraging the Space Wolf's characteristic loyalty to immediate orders over nuanced interpretation, that the Emperor's command had changed. Magnus and the Thousand Sons weren't to be arrested and brought back. They were to be destroyed. Russ complied. Whether he fully understood what he was doing or was genuinely deceived is a question the lore leaves partly open, but he led his fleet to Prospero and began the attack. Magnus, racked with guilt and convinced that he deserved punishment for his catastrophic mistake, made the situation worse. He didn't warn his legion about the incoming attack. He suppressed the communications. He placed a psychic cocoon around Prospero that prevented his warriors from receiving any forewarning at all. He decided that the proper response to being punished was to accept that punishment, and he extended that decision to everyone around him without consulting them. The Thousand Sons had no idea the Space Wolves were coming until the orbital bombardment began. The burning of Prospero was catastrophic. Tizca, the City of Light, the great archive that had taken Magnus decades to build, bombed from orbit. The Thousand Sons Legion fought back without knowing why they were fighting, without understanding the context, without the advantage of preparation that their own Primarch had denied them. By the time the battle was over, 9/10 of the Thousand Sons Legion was dead. Think about that number, 9/10. In a galaxy where Space Marines are extraordinarily expensive to produce, where each one represents years of training and gene seed cultivation and psychological conditioning, 9/10 of an entire legion was killed because the Emperor was too furious to listen to a warning, and because Horus was clever enough to leverage that fury into a military strike against a potential ally. Magnus survived, pulled into the Eye of Terror by a ritual Ahriman had prepared. There, faced with the destruction of his legion and his homeworld and his life's work, faced with the understanding that his father had just sent his brothers to kill him, that the Emperor had not merely punished him, but tried to have him erased, Magnus did the only thing left open to him. He accepted the gift that had been waiting for him all along. He became a demon Primarch of Tzeentch. The Emperor's response to Magnus's desperate attempt to save him had turned a loyal, brilliant, flawed son into one of the most dangerous enemies humanity would ever face. It's not because Magnus was corrupted by chaos before the attack, not because he had been planning this, because the attack itself, and the scale of its destruction, and the absolute silence of any alternative, no mercy, no recognition of intent, no acknowledgement that the man who broke the webway had been trying to save the Imperium, left Magnus with no remaining reason to be loyal. Magnus went to the traitor side, not out of ideology, but out of grief. And Tzeentch had been engineering exactly this outcome for decades, using the Emperor's own rigidity as the lever. The specific horror of the Magnus situation is this. If the Emperor had simply listened to the warning, the entire sequence of events unravels. If he had heard what Magnus was desperately trying to tell him about Horus, the heresy might have been stopped before it properly started. Horus had not yet committed his first major act of treason. The networks of corruption that Lorgar had built over 40 years were in place but not yet activated at full scale. There was still time, but the Emperor was too angry at the form of the message to hear its content. He was too focused on the shattered webway, on the broken wards, on the violation of his explicit orders, to process the information that was literally being shouted at him. His emotional response, entirely human, entirely understandable in isolation, chose the wrong thing to be angry about in the wrong moment, at the cost that would ultimately be paid in billions of lives. The Emperor made Magnus. Magnus tried to save him. The Emperor's response to that attempt drove Magnus to the enemy. And then Magnus joined a siege of terror that almost succeeded in ending everything. That is the story of Prospero, not a story of a bad son punished justly, a story of a son who saw what was coming and broke every rule he was supposed to follow trying to stop it, and was answered with fire. Section 9. The verdict, weighing the worst. Now we have to make a call. We've moved through the evidence carefully. We've looked at 5 major acts: the destruction of the Thunder Warriors, the abandonment of Angron, the secrecy of the Webway project, the burning of Prospero, and the dismissal of Magnus's warning, and the humiliation at Monarchia. Each of these represents a genuine moral failure. Each of them contributed in measurable ways to the catastrophe of the Horus heresy and to the shape of the Imperium in the 10,000 years that followed. We've been honest about the complexity. The Emperor wasn't simply evil. His motivations were often coherent or even comprehensible, and several of these situations involve constraints and circumstances that genuine genius struggled to navigate. But we're not here to grade on a curve. We're here to answer the question, and answering it requires making a choice. So let's be methodical. The case against the Thunder Warriors is strong in terms of what it reveals about the Emperor's character, the willingness to use people and then discard them, to rewrite history to serve the narrative of his rule, but limited in terms of direct consequence. The Thunder Warriors did not cause the Horus heresy. Their elimination, monstrous as it was, affected a relatively small number of people and was contained to the specific moment of Terra's unification. It is an early signal that something was wrong with the Emperor's moral framework, but it is a signal, not the catastrophe itself. The case against the Angron situation is emotionally powerful and genuinely damning. Angron's abandonment, his people left to die on Nuceria, the nails left in his skull for decades. This is one of the most tragic individual stories in the entire setting. And Angron's eventual fall and the World Eater's transformation into something barely human did contribute significantly to the heresy's bloodshed. But the World Eaters, in the grand strategic picture of the Horus heresy, were a blunt instrument, fearsome in combat, horrifying in their ferocity, but not the architects of anything. Angron didn't design the heresy, he was used by it. The Emperor's failure with Angron created a personal tragedy and a legion of berserkers. But it didn't create the conspiracy that made the heresy inevitable. The case against the Webway secrecy is perhaps the most intellectually interesting. The argument runs, if the Emperor had simply told his Primarchs what he was working on, if he had trusted them with the knowledge of the true threat and the true plan, many of the specific manipulations that enabled the heresy would have been diffused. Horus would have had context for his father's absence. Magnus would not have needed to risk using his psychic gifts to send the warning, because there would have been a functional framework for communication. So several of the Primarchs who were corrupted partly through feelings of abandonment and confusion would have had something concrete to trust in, rather than a silence that conspiracy could fill with lies. That argument is compelling, but it's a negative case, an argument about what didn't happen rather than what did. The secrecy created conditions. The secrecy didn't directly cause the heresy's specific architecture. The Magnus case is perhaps the most purely tragic, an innocent attempt to save the Imperium, punished without comprehension of intent. 9/10 of a legion killed. A son turned enemy. The irony of the Emperor's rage at a warning about Horus driving away the very person who could have helped stop Horus. It's almost too painful to sit with comfortably. And yet, Magnus's destruction of the webway was a genuine catastrophe that had real consequences beyond the personal. The demon invasion of the webway tunnels, the years of war that followed within them at tremendous cost, the permanent damage to the Emperor's plans. These were massive, and the Emperor's subsequent fury, however disproportionate, was not entirely without basis. The Prospero story is a tragedy of interlocking failures, not a simple case of innocent victim and guilty monster, which brings us back to Monarchia. The case for Monarchia, as the worst thing the Emperor ever did, is built on a single foundational argument. It was the most preventable and the most pivotal. Every other failure on this list has mitigating factors, circumstances that constrained the Emperor, decisions he made under incomplete information, his situations where the right choice wasn't obviously clear. But Monarchia doesn't have those escape routes. The Emperor watched the word-bearers for a century. He knew exactly who Lorgar was. He knew the depth of Lorgar's faith, the total nature of his devotion, the absolute vulnerability that came with being a person whose entire identity was built around belief. He had 100 years to address this situation in a way that might have preserved something rather than destroyed everything. He chose to wait. He chose to act publicly and catastrophically rather than privately and carefully. He chose to make an example rather than to guide. He chose the Ultramarines, Lorgar's eventual nemesis, the legion that would betray the word-bearers at Calth with particular savagery, as the instrument of the lesson. What he chose to stand in the ash himself, in person, and use his full psychic power to force every single word-bearer to kneel, not because kneeling was necessary, but because the humiliation was the point. And then, this is the detail that matters most, he walked away without offering anything in its place. He destroyed Lorgar's faith without providing a framework for what should replace it. He told Lorgar his worship was wrong without explaining what the right relationship to reality looked like. He took away the organizing principle of an entire human being's existence and left nothing behind. Lorgar's soul, emptied by the Emperor's act, was filled by chaos. And Lorgar then spent 40 years carefully, brilliantly, patiently filling every other available soul the same way. Here is the argument at its simplest. Without Lorgar's fall, there is no heresy. Not the specific heresy that happened, with its 40-year preparation, its warrior lodges seeded through the legions, its careful cultivation of the specific wounds of specific men. Horus might still have resented his father's secrets. Angron would still have burned with pain and rage. Magnus would still have chafed under the Nicaea restrictions. But none of those resentments had a Lorgar to find them, to tend them, to connect them to a larger purpose, and a set of gods willing to sponsor the fire. Lorgar was the architect, the heresy was his cathedral, and the Emperor put the tools in his hand at Monarchia. There is an additional dimension to this argument that makes it feel genuinely damning. The Emperor's failure with Lorgar was not a failure of knowledge or circumstance, as it was a failure of empathy, a failure so specific and so avoidable that it suggests something fundamental about the Emperor's limitations as the leader of a civilization built from human beings. Lorgar was not hiding what he was. He was not concealing his faith or his need or his absolute devotion to the Emperor as a divine figure. It was all completely visible. The temples, the texts, the slower compliance times, the converted worlds, all of it was a transparent expression of who Lorgar was and what he needed. And the Emperor's response was to use that transparency as a targeting solution for the most devastating psychological strike possible. A father, a genuine father, rather than a creator treating his creation as a project variable, looks at that kind of devotion and finds ways to work with it. to channel it, to redirect it towards something that doesn't require the complete destruction of the sun's self-conception. The Emperor had a dozen options between ignore the problem forever and demolish everything Lorgar ever built in the most public way imaginable. He chose the latter, not out of ignorance, but out of something that looks uncomfortably like contempt. The Chaos Gods didn't cause Lorgar to fall. They simply waited for the Emperor to push him off the edge they had prepared. And the Emperor, with all his cosmic wisdom and his 48,000 years of experience and his unmatched ability to perceive the future's branching paths, pushed. Now here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The Emperor wasn't simply careless. He isn't a monster in the straightforward sense. But he made these choices because he was genuinely trying to build something that would save humanity from forces that genuinely were trying to destroy it. He saw the Chaos Gods as the existential threat they are. He spent thousands of years planning ways to protect his species from an enemy that operates across multiple dimensions and across time itself. He sacrificed things that should not have been sacrificed because he believed, maybe correctly, that the alternative was worse. But here's what that doesn't excuse. Goodness, genuine goodness, is not only measured in intentions, it's measured in what you do to the specific people in front of you, in the specific moment you're given. The Emperor's vision was vast. His care for humanity as an abstraction was genuine, or his care for the individual human beings, including his own sons, was either absent or expressed so poorly that it functioned as its opposite. He built an empire meant to save humanity, and in the process treated the humans who built it with him as instruments, secrets, problems to be managed, children to be corrected. Lorgar was told he was wrong. He deserved to be told why in a way he could use. Angron was brought aboard the fleet and handed a legion. He deserved to be mourned alongside. The Thunder Warriors were eliminated. They deserved honesty about what they were and what the end of their service would look like. Magnus was punished. He deserved to be heard. None of them received those things, and the universe paid the price. The worst thing the Emperor ever did was Monarchia. Not because it killed the most people directly, but because it was the most perfectly avoidable, the most clearly foreshadowed, the act that most completely shows the gulf between the Emperor's claimed purpose and the reality of how he treated those closest to him. It is the act where he had the most options and chose the one that caused the most harm. It is the act that turned the most dangerous possible enemy, a devoted man with faith to spare and a genius for moving human hearts, into an enemy. It is the act where the Emperor's greatest strength became its own undoing. He was capable of seeing the future. He was capable of planning decades and centuries ahead. He was capable of anticipating the implications of almost any action. And yet, he looked at Lorgar, and he chose the humiliation. So either he didn't see what it would lead to, which would mean his famous foresight had a catastrophic blind spot in exactly the place it mattered most, or he did see and considered the cost acceptable. Neither answer is comfortable, and both answers lead to the same place. Section 10. The Legacy. 10,000 years of consequences. The Horus heresy ended. The traitors fled into the Eye of Terror. The Emperor was entombed on the Golden Throne. The Great Scouring followed. The Imperium hunting down traitor legions and their allies across the galaxy with a ferocity born of grief and rage, and the absolute need to prove that the survivors still had the strength to impose order. And then the rebuilding began. Reboot Gilliman, the Primarch who had overseen the burning of Monarchia on his father's orders, the one who had stood over the kneeling word-bearers in the ash, the man who had perhaps never fully understood in the moment what he was participating in. Gilliman survived the heresy. He spent the first century of the post-heresy era reshaping the Imperium into something that might survive the loss of its founder. He wrote the Codex Astartes, dividing the great legions into smaller, more independent chapters, so that no future warmaster could ever control a force large enough to threaten terror. He restructured the bureaucracy. He laid the groundwork for institutions that would maintain the civilization through the dark centuries to come. And then he was put in stasis, wounded by a blade poisoned by Fulgrim's demonic corruption, and he slept for 10,000 years. When he woke up, in the late 41st millennium, he found something that broke him, not in the way Lorga had been broken, not suddenly and completely, but in a way that went deep and didn't heal quickly. Because what Guilliman came back to was the Imperium his father had built, reflected in the mirror of 10,000 years of consequence. The imperial truth, his father's grand declaration that science and reason would guide humanity, was heresy. The Inquisition would have you executed for promoting it. The very philosophy the emperor had used to justify burning temples and killing priests was now the philosophy that got you killed. The emperor was a god, not metaphorically, not in the convenient fiction of a state religion that everyone secretly knew was just a mechanism for social cohesion. The people of the Imperium, in the 41st millennium, genuinely, completely, was with no irony or distance, believed that the barely living corpse on the golden throne was a divine being, that his light protected them, that his attention reached from Terra to the furthest battlefields of the galaxy, that the daily deaths of 1,000 psychers sacrificed to maintain his consciousness were not a horror, but a sacred act. The ecclesiarchy, the state church that the emperor had specifically forbidden from having armies, had armies. The Sisters of Battle were those armies, justified through a technicality, but armies nonetheless. The Inquisition that the emperor had created to find and eliminate existential threats to humanity had become one of the most powerful and most terrifying institutions in the Imperium, capable of destroying entire planetary populations on the suspicion of heresy. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the technology cult of Mars, with which the emperor had made his pragmatic alliance because he needed their manufacturing capacity, had become the gatekeepers of human technological knowledge. And their religion, their deliberate mystification of technology, their doctrine of sacred machines and divine formulae, had arrested human scientific development more effectively than any external enemy could have. The Imperium of the 41st millennium was less technologically capable than the Imperium of the Great Crusade, because knowledge had become sacred, and sacred things were not improved upon, only maintained. The Great Crusade had been about expansion. The Imperium of the 41st millennium was about survival, and barely managing that, bleeding from 1,000 wars on 1,000 fronts, as its administrative apparatus so fast and so corrupt that it generated its own disasters faster than any external enemy could create them. Guilliman looked at all of this, the man who had built the foundations of this Imperium, who had worked so hard in those first centuries after the heresy to give it a fighting chance. He looked at what that work had become, and he said something remarkable. He said it would have been better to have burned in Horus's fire than to live to see this. That statement, from a man defined by his commitment to duty and the preservation of what he could preserve, is one of the most devastating assessments of the Emperor's legacy that the entire setting contains. Not from an enemy, not from a traitor, from arguably the most loyal son who survived, as the one who had done more than anyone else to keep the project alive, and his verdict was, "This is not what we were supposed to build. This is not the dream. The 41st Millennium Imperium is a monument to consequences. Every specific detail of its grimness can be traced to a specific decision made in the 30th millennium. The religious fanaticism, that's the imperial truth's failure, and Lorgar's Lectitio Divinitatis filling the vacuum. The technological stagnation, that's the Emperor's alliance with the Mechanicum, and his inability to share his technological genius broadly enough to survive his own absence. The brutal, uncaring bureaucracy that sacrifices billions for the maintenance of the machine, as that's the absence of the Emperor's direct guidance, and the inevitable corruption that follows when power is distributed to institutions without effective accountability. Every Psyker child born in the Imperium faces a grim fate. Either they are found and processed through the brutal systems the Adeptus Astra Telepathica maintains, shaped into a tool for the Imperium's communication and navigation needs, or they are consumed by the warp before they can be trained, or they are hunted down by the black ships and sacrificed to the Golden Throne. 1,000 souls every day, feeding the energy requirements of a machine designed to maintain an emergency solution to a problem that was never supposed to become permanent. The Emperor was supposed to be on the Golden Throne briefly. The webway was supposed to replace warp travel. And the Psyker sacrifices were supposed to end. They haven't ended. They will never end. Because the webway is gone. Because the heresy destroyed the plan. Because 10,000 years of history have built such layers of dependency on the current system that changing it would require dismantling half the infrastructure of human civilization in the middle of a war on every front. The Space Marine chapters, those 1,000-strong inheritors of the Great Legions, each operating independently, each interpreting the Emperor's legacy through the lens of their own culture and their own understanding, they fight. They fight magnificently. They fight with the inherited gene seed of Primarchs who were demigods, and with equipment that the Mechanicum barely understands how to maintain, and with faith in a father god who may not even know they exist. Yet they fight and they die, and they are replaced by the next generation of children who will spend their lives fighting. It is, in its way, exactly the kind of thing the Emperor was trying to prevent. Humanity locked in endless war. Humanity's resources consumed by the requirements of survival rather than directed toward growth and discovery, and the slow, patient work of becoming something better. The Imperium should have been a stepping stone. It became a tomb. Guilliman understood this, coming back to the 41st millennium, trying to fix what could be fixed, running the Indomitus Crusade to push back the advancing darkness that came with the opening of the Great Rift. He understood that he was maintaining a sick patient, not healing one, and that the Imperium he was fighting to preserve was already so far from what it was supposed to be that winning was almost a meaningless concept. There was nothing to win. There was only the fight to survive another day, another century, another millennium. When he finally met the Emperor, when he made the pilgrimage to the Golden Throne and stood in the presence of his father for the first time in 10,000 years, he came out changed. He would not say what had been exchanged, but the man who came out was not the same man who went in. He was angrier, more driven, less patient with the comfortable lies of the institution he had been brought back to serve, more willing to say, in ways that made the ecclesiarchy nervous and the Inquisition uneasy, that the Emperor's dream was worth fighting for, and that the Imperium in its current form was failing that dream catastrophically. He fights for humanity now, not quite for his father, and that distinction matters. The Emperor made that distinction necessary, not because he was evil, but because he was human, deeply, fundamentally human in the worst ways, and a civilization built to worship him as a god could not survive the moment when his children finally saw him clearly. Section 11. Conclusion. The God who was and the corpse on the throne. We've come a long way together. Through the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade, through the burning of temples and the discarding of soldiers and the abandonment of sons, and the shattered hopes of an entire civilization, through the long patience of chaos and the fragile, brilliant, yet flawed attempts of an extraordinary being to build something that would outlast him. And we've arrived at the same place the 41st millennium arrived, looking at the Golden Throne, at the desiccated form of the man who was supposed to save humanity, sustained now by the deaths of those who believe in him, and asking whether this is a success story or a tragedy. The honest answer is that it is both, and neither, and something 40k has always been brilliant at capturing. The specific darkness that comes not from monsters doing monstrous things, but from good intentions pursued with such certainty and such power that they become their own kind of catastrophe. The Emperor was not wrong to want to save humanity. He was not wrong to believe that chaos was the existential threat. He was not wrong that unity and reason and knowledge were better foundations for civilization than division and superstition and ignorance. He was not wrong about any of the large things. He was wrong about the small things. The conversations he didn't have, the trust he didn't extend, the humanity in the people around him that he consistently undervalued because it didn't fit cleanly into the architecture of his plan. He was wrong to kill the Thunder Warriors in secret, wrong to teleport Angron away from his dying people, Wrong to keep the webway secret from the sons who deserved the truth. Wrong to punish Magnus's desperate love with fire. And most of all, most catastrophically, most irreversibly, wrong to burn Monarchia. Wrong not because the policy was wrong, but because the method was wrong. Was because the person in front of him deserved better. Because you cannot build a civilization on the principle of human dignity if you refuse to grant it to the most devoted human being in your orbit. There is a word that doesn't get used often enough in discussions of the Emperor, because the setting tends toward the grandiose, galaxy-spanning wars, demigod warriors, existential stakes. The word is loneliness. The Emperor had been alone for 48,000 years before the Great Crusade. Alone in a way that nothing could fully remedy, because the span of his existence and the nature of his power meant that no one else could really see the world the way he saw it, understand the weight of what he carried, share the full context of decisions that required the perspective of millennia to make sense. Well, that loneliness doesn't excuse his failures, but it explains some of them. The emotional distance, the inability to see his sons as more than instruments, the difficulty communicating the truth of things rather than the required version of things. These are not the behaviors of a monster. They are the behaviors of a person who has spent so long operating alone that the basic mechanics of trust and vulnerability have atrophied beyond recovery. He tried to build a civilization out of reason and light, and the potential of humanity at its best, and his own loneliness and certainty and emotional limitations threaded through every decision like a crack in a dam, small at first, widening gradually, until the pressure of everything he had built found it and tore through. The corpse on the golden throne is the result. He had 10,000 psychers a year to feed him. Billions of lives spent to maintain a machine running an emergency protocol that was supposed to last months. A civilization that has been fighting for its survival for so long that it no longer remembers what it was supposed to be surviving for. Lorgar, the son the Emperor broke, sits in the Eye of Terror now, on a demon world called Sikaris. Writing sermons to gods the Emperor told him didn't exist. He was right. The gods exist. The Emperor was wrong. And the galaxy pays for that wrongness every single day. That's the answer to the title's question. The worst thing the Emperor ever did was Monarchia. But Monarchia didn't happen in isolation. It happened because of who the Emperor was. Brilliant, ancient, caring for humanity as an abstraction and failing the specific humans who needed him. Or as it happened because he had decided what the universe should be and couldn't tolerate the moment when someone he loved showed him a version of it he hadn't approved. And it set in motion the chain of events that made everything else possible. Lorgar's fall, the heresy's design, 40 years of patient, brilliant, furious preparation by a man the Emperor had convinced, against all his own intentions, that the Emperor's enemies were right. The Emperor builds, the Emperor dreams, the Emperor sacrifices, the Emperor sits on his throne, and thousands die to feed the machine that keeps his light burning, so that ships can navigate the warp, so that the Astronomicon can guide humanity's fleets to their destinations, so that the civilization he built doesn't collapse entirely into the dark, and down on a million worlds. What the people he claimed to love live short, brutal, terrifying lives in the shadow of the institutions his failures created, worshipping a god who told them there were no gods, sacrificing themselves to a machine that was supposed to be temporary, fighting a war that was supposed to be won 10,000 years ago. That's Warhammer 40,000. That's the grimdark. Not evil winning, evil always losing, technically, while the costs of victory become indistinguishable from defeat. An emperor who loved humanity enough to die for it, and couldn't manage to love a single one of its representatives quite enough to talk to him honestly. The worst thing he ever did was Monarchia. The second worst thing was everything that came from it. And the thing that is somehow both the saddest and most fitting about all of this is that down in the depths of the Imperial Palace, surrounded by his custodians and the dying psychics whose deaths sustain him, the Emperor endures. Whether he thinks, whether he knows, whether somewhere in the vast psychic presence that maintains the Astronomicon there is awareness of what his decisions produced, we don't know. The law is deliberately ambiguous. Perhaps he sees it all. Perhaps he weighs it against the alternative he was trying to prevent. Perhaps he would do it all again if given the chance. That ambiguity is the point. It keeps the question alive. It keeps this universe aware. And it means we'll be here 10,000 years from now, still arguing about the God Emperor of mankind, who he was, what he cost, or whether the Imperium was worth the price. Still asking the question he never answered honestly in life: was the Emperor of mankind actually good? If you made it all the way through this journey, through the Thunder Warriors, and Angron, and Monarchia, and Prospero, and the 10,000 years of consequences, thank you. Genuinely, this is the kind of law that rewards the people who spend time with it, because it doesn't offer clean answers. It offers a mirror, a very grimdark, very elaborate, very Space Marine adjacent mirror, but a mirror nonetheless. If you found this kind of deep dive into the law worthwhile, if sitting with the Emperor's failures and trying to understand them felt like time well spent, then you're exactly who this channel exists for. Leave a comment telling me which of the Emperor's acts you think was the worst, because I know a significant number of you will argue for Magnus, or for the Webway secret, or for something I didn't even fully cover here, and I want to hear those arguments. The 40k law is rich enough that reasonable people can disagree, and that's what makes it worth discussing. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a genuinely good moment. There's more lore ahead, more stories, more deep dives, more moments from this universe that deserve the time and quiet to properly explore. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell if you want to make sure you're here for them. This is Q on 40k. The Emperor protects. Whether he should or not is, as always, a much more complicated question.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.